does shit just happen? Whenever you find people like dealing with stuff in their lives, right? So racist stop and searches, sexual assault, the fact that politicians continually lie and cheat and try and pretend that they actually care about our lives. The temptation is to look on it and say, well, shit just happens. But I mean, the problem I have is that really it just insults us. It insults us as human beings, because it implies that humans have always been like this, and that there isn't a historical reason for the things we have, and therefore as well, that means that we could never change it, and humans can never be different. Sometimes it can be useful to understand history, not just because you know what happened, but also as well because it shows examples of how oppressed and exploited people actually change the world. But there's another reason as well, and that being that the way you understand history influences the way you relate to your everyday, and it relates to changing the everyday as well. And in that sense, history is a weapon. Now, in society generally, we're taught to think one or two things, right? Firstly, that great men make history just because of their personal excellence. Or the other side of things is that you end up with a history simply just being a random collection of facts. There's no order to anything, shit just happens. And I don't think either of those things are true, because what both of those things do is write the actions of masses of people, ordinary people, out of history. And the reality is, of course, that nothing in the world could happen if it wasn't for the mass of people making choices in their daily lives. I think what we take is a revolutionary perspective on history. And from Marx as well, we come up with 2 points, right? And we have these 2 points, which can sometimes seem in contradiction, but are actually integrally related. Okay, so the first point is that the emancipation of the working class, of all oppressed and exploited people, has to be the act of the working class. And by that, it has to be the working class making their own revolution. Ordinary people making their own revolution. The other point as well, the second point, which can seem in contradiction to the first, is that the way that society looks, the ideas, the forms of society, are determined by the way that things are produced. The modes of production, right? Why do those things seem in contradiction? Well, if it was the case that simply the way that things are produced determines society, so if economics determines everything, then how is it that all ordinary people can change their lives? Because if that was the case, then all we'd have to do is just sit back and play Candy Crush all afternoon, or until the final crisis of capitalism. Those two things seem in contradiction. But actually, if you take back what economics is, what production is, to what it is hard, actually they're not. You think about the production of commodities, the production of things, right? The division of labour, so that different people are making different things. That's existed for a long time in society. Go back to the dawn of the age when people were prancing around in the forest and slinging mud at each other. Caveman number 1 would say to caveman number 2, you go and pick the berries and I'll go and get the firewood, so tonight we both have, a warmth and we have something to eat. Now, under capitalism, the huge difference is that people are so alienated, they're so distant from each other and from the forces that control their lives, that it seems like economics is a thing that determines our life. Economics is like the weather. The same thing with history. Now, the importance for ordinary people to know their history and to know what change means is that they can then determine the world. Coming back to what I said about history is a weapon. It's a weapon that looks different in terms of the different people who handle it. For the ruling class, it's something that writes out all actions of ordinary people out of history. It writes out all possibility of changing anything. For revolutionaries, history is a means by which not just you can understand where you're coming from, but actually to decide where you go. The uprising in Bosnia is a perfect example of that. It's a perfect example of people making history, but not in circumstances of their own choosing. 20 years ago, Bosnia was part of a wider federation of countries called Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was impoverished and basically abused by international banks, and kind of as a result, the ruling class fostered a really brutal set of civil wars. Ever since then, Bosnia has been divided ethnically, right, with this huge superstate imposed by the international community. And for 20 years, nothing has happened. Suddenly, this February, workers and students have started to come out on the streets and to protest against, you know, unemployment, like the horrible, like the horrific, like price of living. In Tuzla, they actually, a town in the northeast, they actually burned down the local government.
Kažite nam ministri, naši poslanici, zašto ratni invalidi žive ko jadnici na ivici života, vama bitna svota, poznajete osjećaj, zove se sramota.
Is that you now have these direct democratic groups, direct assemblies of citizens, huge meetings called plenums, which are making the most democratic decisions in the towns. I think what's happening in Bosnia is incredibly important. It's a case where you actually have people understanding, you know, being affected, being pushed into action by the economic shit that they're facing, right? But at the same time, making decisions, making active choices that mean they sculpt that, they actually turn it into something that is really productive. That slogan, death to nationalism, is incredibly powerful if we think about how much racism there is at the moment in Europe and how much as well it prevents the possibility of a better world. So what relevance does, you know, Bosnia have for us? I think that the very same question of agency, is incredibly relevant if you think about all the stuff that happened in the riots in 2011 in London and the rest of the UK. You had people who were going out on the streets and they were saying for the first time in their life they've had control over their own destiny. It may be, you know, through whatever mediated form, but they had control for the first time. They actually ran the streets for the first time. Now, in terms of asking, you know, how can we actually change history? How can we organise things in a way that, you know, we can determine the world around us? That question of agency is crucial, because obviously the difference between what happened in London and what happened in Bosnia is there's organisation. There are people who are not just responding to events, but actually thinking, how do we transform this situation into what we actually want? And that, in that sense, that's the real important task for us. If we want to be revolutionaries, if we want to change the world, we have to think about how we properly organise. So if you come back to what the importance of historical materialism is in relation to all of that, is understanding that change is not simply like an act of responding to the world, is an act of actually choosing what you want to do, and how you organise in order to do that. And if we want to see a world without racism, if you want to see a world without corruption for politicians, if you want to see a world without sexual harassment, if you want to see a world without exploitation and unemployment in prisons, without all the daily drudgery of oppression and alienation, then we do have to organise. And so that's why understanding your history is really important.
Kažite nam ministri, naši poslanici, zašto ratni invalidi žive ko jadnici na ivici života, vama bitna svota, poznajete osjećaj, zove se